Tonight, we explore one of the most beautiful teachings in Zen Buddhism. It is called the finger and the moon. This teaching has been shared for centuries because it points the way to discovering the profound peace that exists beyond words. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. Zen reminds us that words and teachings can point toward truth, toward peace, and the deeper nature of things. But the words themselves are not the truth. They are guides, gentle hands that direct our gaze. When we mistake the pointing finger for what it points toward, we get stuck. We collect ideas instead of experiencing reality. Tonight, we will explore this teaching through stories and reflections. These stories remind us that the deepest truths cannot be captured in language. They can only be lived, experienced, met directly in the quiet of our own presence. As we begin, let your body settle wherever you are resting. There is nothing you need to figure out. Simply listen and let these ancient teachings wash over you like moonlight on still water. The stories will carry you. The wisdom will find its way in. Take a slow breath and let us begin. There is an old story about a Zen master who was asked by a student to explain the nature of enlightenment. The master pointed silently at the moon, which hung full and bright in the evening sky. The student nodded eagerly and said, "Ah, yes, I understand. Your finger is crooked." The master shook his head sadly. The student had missed the point entirely. This small story captures something important about how we relate to teachings, to words, to all the ways we try to communicate what matters most. We are so used to focusing on the messenger that we forget to receive the message. We examine the pointing finger so carefully that we never look up to see what it is pointing toward. This happens more often than we might think. We read books about peace and remain restless. We study descriptions of happiness and stay unsatisfied. We collect ideas about presence while our minds wander far from the moment we are in. The words were meant to help us, to guide our attention, to point the way. But somewhere along the journey, we began treating the words themselves as the destination. Zen Buddhism has always been cautious about language. The early teachers knew that words are powerful tools, but they also knew that tools can be mistaken for treasures. A hammer helps you build a house, but you do not live inside the hammer. Words help you find your way to truth, but you cannot live inside the words. At some point, you must set them down and enter directly into what they describe. This does not mean words are useless or that teachings have no value. The finger pointing at the moon is genuinely helpful if you follow where it points. The problem arises only when we forget to look beyond the finger, when we become so fascinated with the pointing that we never see the moon itself. Let us explore a story that shows how this confusion can arise, even among those who love wisdom deeply. In a valley known for its libraries and scholars, there lived a teacher named Cato who was famous for his beautiful way with words. When he spoke about compassion, people wept. When he described the peace that comes from letting go, his listeners felt their shoulders soften and their breathing slow. His lectures drew students from distant provinces, all hoping to hear the wisdom that flowed so gracefully from his lips. Cato had spent 30 years refining his teaching. He had studied the great texts, memorized the important passages, and developed a gift for making difficult ideas feel simple and close. He could take the most abstract teaching and make it land in the heart of an ordinary farmer or merchant. This was his skill, and he was proud of it. His school thrived. Students filled the lecture hall each morning, taking careful notes, discussing his words late into the evening. They could quote his phrases from memory. They debated the finer points of his interpretations. By any measure, Cato was a successful teacher, but there was one student who troubled him. Her name was Lena, and she had arrived at the school 3 years ago after walking for many weeks from her home in the northern mountains. She attended every lecture. She listened carefully to every word, but she never seemed satisfied. While other students nodded and smiled when Cato spoke beautifully, Lena would frown slightly, as if waiting for something that never came. While others filled notebooks with his teachings, Lena wrote very little. When he asked her questions, she would pause for a long time before answering, and her answers often surprised him. One afternoon, after a lecture on the nature of stillness, Lena approached him. "Teacher," she said, "your words about stillness were beautiful, but I have been here 3 years, and I am not still. I know many things about stillness now. I can explain it to others, but when I sit alone at night, my mind is like a river in flood. What am I missing?" Cato felt a flash of irritation, which he quickly suppressed. "Perhaps you need to study more deeply," he suggested. "Understanding takes time." "I have studied deeply," Lena replied gently. "I can recite your lectures from memory. I understand the concepts, but understanding and experiencing seem to be different things, and I do not know how to cross from one to the other." Cato did not have a good answer for this. He told her to be patient and returned to his preparations for the next day. But her question stayed with him, a small thorn he could not quite remove. That winter, a traveler came to the valley seeking shelter from a heavy snow. She was an old woman named Kara, who had spent most of her life wandering from place to place, staying nowhere for long. She had no title and no reputation. She was simply a pilgrim who had walked many roads. The scholars of the valley welcomed her politely, but paid her little attention. She was not educated in the way they valued. She had read few books and could not debate fine points of philosophy. But Cato noticed something unusual about her. When she sat in his lecture hall, she did not take notes like the others. She simply listened with a quality of attention he had rarely seen. And when she walked through the snowy courtyards, there was a stillness about her that his words had always described but never quite captured. One evening, Cato found himself walking beside her as snow fell gently around them. The valley was quiet, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the white blanket on the ground. "You have attended my lectures," Cato said. "What do you think of them?" Kara was quiet for a moment, watching the snowflakes drift down through the lantern light. "Your words are very beautiful," she said. "They are like paintings of mountains. Someone who has never seen a mountain might look at your paintings and feel they understand what mountains are." "And what is wrong with that?" "Nothing is wrong with it, as long as they remember that the painting is not the mountain. But I watch your students, and many of them seem to be collecting paintings. They have galleries full of beautiful images. But I wonder how many of them have actually climbed a mountain, felt the rock beneath their hands, breathed the thin air at the summit." Cato felt the thorn of Lena's question press deeper. "What would you have me do differently?" Kara stopped walking and turned to face him. The snow had settled on her grey hair, and her eyes were kind but direct. "I would not presume to tell you how to teach. But I can tell you what I have noticed in my own wandering. Words are like fingers pointing at the moon. They are helpful. They show us where to look. But at some point, we must stop staring at the finger and actually look at the moon. Your words point very beautifully. But do your students know how to look where you are pointing? Or have they become so fascinated with your finger that they forget there is a moon at all? She continued walking, leaving Kato standing in the falling snow, her words settling into him like the snowflakes settling on the ground. In the days that followed, Kato began to watch his students differently. He noticed how eagerly they wrote down his phrases, how proudly they quoted him to each other, how heated their debates became about the exact meaning of his words. They were studying his finger with great dedication. But were any of them looking at the moon? He tried an experiment. In the middle of a lecture on presence, he stopped speaking. He simply sat in silence, looking at the students, inviting them to be present rather than to think about presence. The students grew uncomfortable. They shifted in their seats. They glanced at each other nervously. After a few minutes, one of them asked if something was wrong. Kato realized that his students did not know what to do with silence. They knew only how to process words. He sought out Kara again and found her sitting by a window, watching the snow melt from the eaves as the weather warmed. "I have been thinking about what you said," he told her. "I believe you are right. My students have been collecting my words, but they have not been following where the words point. But I do not know how to teach differently. Words are my only tool." Kara nodded slowly. "Words are a tool, but perhaps they are not your only tool. What if you used words not to explain, but to point? What if your teaching was less about filling your students with ideas and more about directing their attention toward their own direct experience? How would I do that? I cannot tell you exactly. Each teacher must find their own way. But I can share what helped me long ago, when I was as full of ideas as your students are now." She turned from the window to face him. "I had a teacher once who spoke very little. When I asked him questions, he would often answer with another question, or with silence, or by directing my attention somewhere unexpected. At first, I found this frustrating. I wanted explanations. I wanted ideas I could hold on to. But slowly I began to realize what he was doing. He was refusing to let me stay with the finger. Every time I tried to grasp his words, he would point again, insisting that I look at the moon itself." "What was the moon for you?" Kara smiled. "This moment, this breath, this simple fact of being here, alive, aware." He could have explained it to me 1,000 times, and I would have understood the explanation without ever tasting the reality. Instead, he kept pointing, kept redirecting, until finally I stopped grabbing at his finger and looked where he was pointing. What I saw there was not something his words could have given me. It was something I had to see for myself. Kato sat with this for a long time. He thought about all the beautiful explanations he had crafted over the years, all the elegant phrases his students had memorized. He had given them many paintings of mountains. But had he ever helped them climb? When the snow finally melted and Kara prepared to continue her wandering, Kato walked with her to the edge of the valley. "Thank you," he said. "You have shown me something important. I am not sure yet how to teach differently, but I know now that I must try." Kara placed a weathered hand on his arm. "Your words were never the problem. They were always helpful, always pointing in the right direction. The only change needed is to remember, and to help your students remember, that the words are not the destination. They are simply the finger. The moon is what matters, and the moon can only be seen directly, never through words alone. She walked away into the spring morning, and Cato returned to his school with something new growing in him. His teaching began to change, slowly at first, then more noticeably. He still spoke beautifully, but now he would pause often, inviting silence, asking students to notice their own breath, their own presence, the simple fact of being here in this room at this moment. He began using questions more than explanations. He began pointing with his words rather than explaining with them. Some students found this change confusing. They wanted the old Cato, the one who gave them beautiful ideas to collect. But others, like Lena, began to understand. The words were never meant to be grasped. They were meant to guide attention towards something that could only be experienced directly. Years later, when visitors asked about Cato's teaching, his students would struggle to explain it. "He does not give us much to hold on to," they would say. But somehow, what he points toward becomes clear. This inability to capture his teaching in words was, Cato knew, the highest compliment they could offer. It meant they had finally learned to look at the moon. This story shows us something important about the finger and the moon. Cato was a gifted teacher, but his very eloquence had become an obstacle. His students were so enchanted by his pointing that they forgot to look where he pointed. It took a wandering stranger, someone outside his world of words, to help him see what was missing. Zen teaches us that the deepest truths resist being captured in language. We can talk about peace, but talking about peace is not the same as being at peace. We can describe presence, but the description is like a photograph of a meal. It shows you what the meal looks like, but it cannot nourish you. Only eating the meal can do that. This does not mean we should abandon words or stop studying teachings. The finger is genuinely helpful. Without it, we might never think to look at the moon at all. But we must remember that the finger's purpose is to guide our gaze, not to become the object of our attention. When we hold teachings lightly, when we use them as pointers rather than possessions, they can do their work. They can direct us toward the direct experience that was always their aim. The Buddha himself spoke of this. He compared his teachings to a raft that carries us across a river. The raft is useful, even essential, for crossing. But once we reach the other shore, we do not strap the raft to our backs and carry it with us forever. We set it down with gratitude and walk forward on our own feet. The teachings serve their purpose and then must be released so that we can actually live what they have pointed toward. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a town built along a river, there lived a young man named Hiro who had devoted himself to collecting wisdom. Since childhood, he had been fascinated by the teachings of the great masters. He memorized their sayings, studied their stories, and could quote from dozens of texts without hesitation. By the time he was 25, he considered himself quite knowledgeable about the path to peace. Hiro took pride in his collection. When people had questions about spiritual matters, they came to him. He could always provide an answer, a teaching, a quote from some wise source. His mind was like a library, well organized, and always ready to provide the relevant text. But despite all his knowledge, Hiro was not particularly peaceful. He slept poorly, often lying awake reviewing the teachings he had memorized or planning which ones he would study next. He was quick to argue when someone misquoted a text or misunderstood a teaching. He felt a constant pressure to learn more, as if his collection was never quite complete. One autumn, a festival brought many visitors to the town, including an old woman named Yuna, who sold simple pottery from a small stall in the market. Her bowls and cups were nothing fancy, just honest work with clean lines. But there was something about her that drew people to her stall. She moved with an unhurried ease. She spoke simply and directly, and there was a quality of stillness about her that Hiro noticed from across the market square. He approached her stall out of curiosity. Most potters were eager to talk about their craft, to explain their techniques and describe their training. But when Hiro asked Yuna about her work, she simply shrugged. "I make pots," she said. "The clay tells me what it wants to become. I just listen." Hiro was intrigued. This sounded like something a wise teacher might say. He tried to engage her in a discussion about listening and presence, quoting several relevant teachings he had memorized. Yuna listened politely, then picked up one of her teacups and handed it to him. "Feel this," she said. Hiro took the cup. It was warm from the sun, rough in some places and smooth in others. It fit his hand comfortably, as if it had been made just for him. "What do you feel?" Yuna asked. Hiro began to describe the cup, using words he had learned from teachings about mindfulness and direct experience. He spoke of being present with the object, of sensing its qualities without judgment, of allowing awareness to rest on physical sensation. Yuna held up her hand to stop him. "I did not ask what you know about feeling. I asked what you feel." Hiro paused. The question seemed too simple. Of course he felt the cup. He could describe every aspect of the experience in precise and educated terms. But Yuna was watching him with patient eyes, waiting for something that his words had not yet delivered. And in that pause, Hiro noticed something uncomfortable. He had been so busy explaining the experience that he had barely had the experience at all. His mind had jumped immediately to the teachings, to the concepts, to the words that described what he should be feeling. The actual feeling had been almost completely overshadowed. He looked down at the cup in his hands and tried again. This time, instead of reaching for words, he just felt the warmth, the texture, the weight, the way it rested in his palm. Nothing special, nothing profound, just a cup in his hands on a warm autumn day. "There," Yuna said softly. "Now you are actually holding the cup, not just thinking about holding it." Hiro felt something shift in him. A small opening, like a window letting in fresh air. "I know so many teachings about being present," he said slowly. "But I was not actually present at all, was I? I was just thinking about presence." Yuna nodded. "You have collected many fingers pointing at the moon. That is not a bad thing. But collecting fingers is different from seeing the moon. You have gathered so many descriptions that you have forgotten to taste what they describe." She took the cup back from him gently and set it with the others on her stall. "The teachings you have memorized are not wrong. They are all pointing in the right direction. But somewhere along the way, you started looking at the fingers instead of following where they point. You became a collector of pointers instead of a seer of the moon. How do I change? Hiro asked. How do I stop collecting and start seeing? You have already begun, Yuna said. Just now, when you actually felt the cup instead of explaining the feeling, you were seeing the moon, even if only for a moment. The teachings you have collected can help you find that moment again, but they cannot have that moment for you. That you must do yourself. She picked up another cup and began shaping its handle with her thumb, her attention fully absorbed in the simple task. Hiro watched her for a long time. There was nothing special about what she was doing, just an old woman working with clay. But there was also something precious about it, a quality of direct engagement that all his teachings had been pointing toward. He visited Yuna's stall several more times during the festival. She never gave him formal teachings or asked him to become her student. She just worked on her pottery and occasionally asked him simple questions that cut through his habit of explaining. What do you hear right now? How does the ground feel under your feet? What is it like to breathe this air? Each question was a finger pointing at the moon. But unlike the teachings he had memorized, these questions could not be collected. They demanded immediate response. They pulled him out of his library of concepts and into the direct experience of being alive. When the festival ended and Yuna prepared to move on to the next town, Hiro came to thank her. "You have given me something important," he said. "But I am not sure how to hold it. I am afraid I will go back to my old habits, collecting words instead of following where they point." Yuna considered this. The habit is strong. You will probably fall back into it many times. But now you know the difference. When you notice yourself explaining instead of experiencing, you can pause. You can feel the cup in your hands again. You can ask yourself, am I looking at the finger or am I looking at the moon? She handed him a small, simple cup from her stall. Keep this, not as something to think about, but as a reminder to feel. Whenever you notice yourself lost in concepts, hold this cup. Really hold it. Let it bring you back to what all your teachings have been pointing toward. Hiro kept that cup for the rest of his life. He continued to study, continued to learn, continued to value the wisdom he had collected. But something had changed. He held his knowledge more lightly now. He remembered that the teachings were fingers, not moons. And when he found himself lost in explanation, he would pick up the simple cup, feel its weight and texture, and let it bring him home to the moment, to the direct experience that all his words were always meant to serve. Both of these stories show us the same truth from different perspectives. Kato the teacher discovered that his beautiful words, though well-intentioned, had become obstacles for his students. Hiro the collector discovered that his vast knowledge, though accurate, had become a barrier between himself and what the knowledge described. Both needed someone from outside their usual world to help them see what they were missing. Zen Buddhism reminds us again and again that the map is not the territory. We can study maps our whole lives and never actually travel anywhere. We can accumulate descriptions of distant lands and never feel foreign soil beneath our feet. The map is helpful, even necessary, but it is not the journey itself. At some point, we must fold up the map and actually walk. This teaching is gentle, not harsh. It does not say that words are bad or that learning is a waste of time. It simply reminds us of the purpose that words and learning serve. They are meant to guide us toward direct experience, toward the moon itself. When we remember this, we can use them wisely. When we forget, we end up staring at fingers while the moon rises unnoticed behind us. The Buddha pointed at many moons during his years of teaching. He spoke of impermanence, of compassion, of the nature of suffering, and the path to freedom. But he never claimed that his words were the truth itself. He called his teachings a raft, a vehicle for crossing to the other shore. He said that after using them to cross, we should set them down rather than carrying them as burdens. The teachings had done their work. What mattered now was walking forward on our own feet. Tonight, as you listen to these stories, you might hold them the same way. They are fingers pointing toward something. If they are helpful, if they guide your attention toward peace or presence or understanding, let them do their work. But do not mistake them for the destination. The moon they point toward is not in the words. It is in your own direct experience of being here, being alive, being aware in this present moment. Let your body settle now and take a slow, gentle breath. Notice how it feels to simply be here, without needing to explain or understand anything. This moment needs no words to be complete. It simply is, and you are simply here within it. We have seen how words and teachings can become obstacles when we mistake them for what they describe. Now let us explore this truth from another perspective. What happens when we live more in our ideas about life than in life itself? We all carry maps in our minds. These are not paper maps with lines and symbols, but something more subtle. They are our beliefs about how things work, our expectations about what we will find, our stories about who we are and what the world is like. These mental maps are built from everything we have learned and experienced. They help us navigate, plan, and make sense of our days. But maps have a limitation that is easy to forget. A map is always a simplification. It shows the main roads, but not the wildflowers growing beside them. It marks the rivers, but not the way sunlight dances on the water. It indicates the mountains, but not the feeling of wind at the summit. The map gives us information, but it cannot give us experience. Zen teaches that many of us spend more time looking at our maps than at the land we are actually walking through. We consult our ideas about life so constantly that we barely notice life itself. We know what we expect to see, what we have been told we will find, what our beliefs predict, and so we see our expectations instead of what is actually here. This is another way of looking at the finger instead of the moon. Our mental maps are fingers pointing at reality. They can be helpful guides. But when we mistake the map for the territory, when we trust our ideas more than our direct experience, we miss something essential. We walk through a living world while staring at a picture of it. Let us explore a story that shows how this confusion can shape a life. In a region known for its vast forests and hidden valleys, there lived a mapmaker named Toma, who had never actually traveled beyond his small village. This might seem strange for someone in his profession, but Toma had his reasons. He had inherited his father's workshop, which contained the most extensive collection of maps in the region. Travelers and scholars had been contributing to this collection for generations. Toma had access to detailed drawings of every road, river, and mountain within 100 miles. He knew these maps so well that he felt he already knew the land. When travelers came seeking guidance, Toma could advise them with great precision. He would spread out his maps and trace routes with his finger, describing what they would find at each turn. The third bridge is narrow, so cross carefully. The eastern pass is steeper than the western one, but shorter. He spoke with such confidence that travelers trusted him completely. And for the most part, his directions were accurate. The maps were good, the information reliable. Travelers followed his advice and reached their destinations. Toma's reputation grew. People said he knew the land better than anyone, even though he had never walked it himself. But there was one valley that troubled him. It was called the Valley of Mists, and the map showed it as a blank space with only the vaguest outlines. Different travelers had tried to map it over the years, but their drawings never agreed. Some showed a river running east. Others showed it running west. Some marked dense forest. Others indicated open meadows. The valley seemed to resist being captured on paper. This bothered Toma deeply. A blank space on a map felt like a personal failure. He was supposed to know the land. How could he advise travelers about a place he could not describe? One autumn, an old traveler named Sen arrived at his workshop. Sen had spent most of his life walking from place to place, never staying anywhere for long. His clothes were worn, his boots patched many times over, and his face was weathered by decades of sun and wind. But his eyes were bright and attentive, taking in everything around him with quiet interest. Sen wanted information about the Valley of Mists. He had heard stories about it and wished to see it for himself. Toma spread out all the maps he had of the region, pointing to the blank space with frustration. "I cannot help you with this valley," he admitted. "The maps do not agree. Some say one thing, some say another. I do not know which to trust." Sen looked at the maps with interest, but without the reverence Toma expected. "These are useful drawings," he said. "But why do you need them to agree? The valley is what it is, regardless of what the papers show. But how can I advise you without accurate information? How can you travel safely without knowing what you will find?" Sen smiled gently. "I have traveled many places. The pictures can never capture everything." Toma felt defensive. "My maps have guided hundreds of travelers safely to their destinations. They are reliable. I do not doubt it. For well-traveled roads, maps are excellent guides. But for places like this valley, perhaps the map must be made by walking, not by looking at papers." He paused, studying Toma with a curious expression. "Have you ever walked these lands yourself? Not to make maps, but simply to see what is there." Toma hesitated. "I know the lands through the maps. I have studied them for years." "That is not what I asked. Have you walked them? Have you felt the mud of that eastern road after rain? Have you heard the sound the river makes at the fork? Have you smelled the pines in the high passes?" Toma had no answer. He had not done any of these things. He knew the information, but he did not know the experience. Sen sat down on a stool near the window, looking out at the autumn colors beyond the village. "I once met a man who had memorized every poem ever written about cherry blossoms. He could recite hundreds of verses describing their beauty, their fragrance, their brief and precious blooming. But when I asked him about his favorite cherry tree, he grew quiet. He had never actually sat beneath one. He knew everything about cherry blossoms except what it felt like to watch them fall. He turned back to Toma. "Your maps are like those poems. They describe the land beautifully, but description is not experience. You know what travelers have said about these places, but do you know the places themselves?" Toma felt something uncomfortable stirring in him. He had always believed that knowledge was enough, that studying the maps was as good as walking the roads. But Sen's questions opened a crack in that certainty. "Come with me to the Valley of Mists," Sen offered. "Not to make a better map, but simply to see what is there. Let the land show you something your papers cannot." Toma hesitated. He had responsibilities at the workshop. Travelers depended on him. And truthfully, he was afraid. The world beyond his maps was unknown, unpredictable. His maps gave him a sense of control that the actual land could not provide. But the crack Sen had opened kept widening. That night, Toma lay awake, thinking about all the places he knew only as lines on paper. He thought about the rivers he had never heard, the mountains he had never climbed, the villages he had never visited. His knowledge felt suddenly thin, like a painting with nothing behind it. In the morning, he told Sen he would come. The journey to the Valley of Mists took several days. At first, Toma found himself constantly comparing what he saw to what his maps had shown. The road curves left here, just as the map indicated. That hill is where the map showed a hill. He was checking reality against his pictures, as if the land needed to prove itself to his papers. But as the days passed, something began to shift. He noticed things the maps had never mentioned. The way the light changed as they moved through different kinds of forest. The sounds of different birds in different valleys. The particular smell of the air near water. These details were not important for navigation, so the maps had left them out. But walking through the land, they were everywhere, a richness of experience that no paper could hold. Sen walked beside him in easy silence, stopping sometimes to look at things that seemed ordinary. A particular rock, a pattern of clouds, the way a stream braided around stones. He did not explain why he stopped. He simply paid attention, fully present with whatever he was seeing. One evening, as they made camp near a small waterfall, Toma tried to express what he was feeling. "I knew this waterfall was here. It is marked on my maps. But I did not know it was like this. The sound of it, the mist on my face, the way the last light catches the spray. The map showed me where to find a waterfall, but it could not show me the waterfall itself." Sen nodded. "The map told you about the waterfall, but now you have met the waterfall. These are very different things. One lives in your mind as information. The other lives in your whole being as experience." They reached the Valley of Mists on the 4th day. Toma understood immediately why the maps had never agreed. The valley was not one thing. It shifted and changed depending on the time of day, the weather, the season. Morning mists transformed its shape entirely. What looked like forest in one light revealed itself as scattered groves in another. The river that confused the mapmakers did not flow in a single direction. How could anyone map this accurately? The place refused to hold still long enough to be captured, but Zen seemed delighted. This is why I wanted to come here. This valley does not fit on paper. It insists on being experienced directly. You cannot know it from a distance. You must be inside it, moving through it, letting it change around you. They spent 3 days in the valley, and Thomas stopped trying to map it. Instead, he simply walked and looked and listened. He watched the mists rise and fall. He followed the river's many branches. He sat on hillsides and let the changing landscape wash over him without trying to fix it in his mind. On the last evening, sitting beside a stream that would look completely different in the morning, Toma felt something release in him. "I have spent my whole life trusting maps more than land," he said quietly. "I thought knowing the description was the same as knowing the thing, but now I see how much I was missing. The maps are useful, but they are shadows of what is real. I was living in the shadows and calling them the world." Zen poked at their small fire, sending sparks up into the darkness. Maps are good servants but poor masters. When we use them to help us explore, they serve us well. But when we use them to replace exploration, they become prisons. We end up walking through our ideas about the world instead of walking through the world itself. What do I do now? I cannot stop making maps. People depend on them. You do not need to stop. But perhaps you can hold them differently. Remember that every map is a finger pointing at something. The map points at the land, but the map is not the land. Offer your maps to travelers as guides, not as substitutes for their own seeing. And perhaps, sometimes, walk the lands yourself. Let the territory teach you things the map cannot know. When Toma returned to his village, he continued his work. He still spread maps before travelers and traced routes with his finger. But something in his manner had changed. He spoke now of what the maps could show and also of what they could not. He encouraged travelers not just to follow the lines, but to notice what they found along the way. And sometimes, when the workshop was quiet, he would leave his papers behind and walk into the forests himself, not to make better maps, but simply to meet the land that his maps could only point toward. This story shows us how our mental maps can become substitutes for direct experience. Toma knew so much about the land that he had forgotten to actually know the land. His information was accurate, but it was thin, lacking the depth that only presence can provide. Buddhism teaches that our concepts are like this. We build ideas about life, about ourselves, about how things work. These ideas can be useful. They help us navigate and plan. But when we mistake them for reality itself, we end up living at a distance from our actual experience. We walk through the territory while staring at the map, and we miss the wildflowers, the bird song, the feeling of ground beneath our feet. The finger and the moon are present everywhere in our lives. Every concept we hold is a finger pointing at some aspect of reality. Our ideas about love point at love, but they are not love itself. Our beliefs about happiness point at happiness, but believing is not the same as being happy. Our understanding of peace points at peace, but understanding is different from resting in peace directly. Zen invites us to notice when we are living in our maps instead of in the territory. This is not always easy. Our maps feel familiar and safe. They give us a sense of knowing, of having things figured out. The actual territory is more uncertain, more changeable, more alive. It asks us to pay attention in ways our maps do not require. But the territory is also richer than any map can show. When we look up from our concepts and meet life directly, we find textures and colors and depths that no description could capture. We discover that reality is not flat like a picture. It is alive, and it invites us to be alive with it. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a prosperous trading city, there lived a merchant named Nara, who was known for the precision of her record-keeping. Every transaction she made was carefully documented. Every coin that passed through her hands was counted and recorded. Her ledgers were works of art, neat columns of numbers that tracked her wealth down to the smallest amount. Nara had started with very little and built her fortune through careful attention to these numbers. She knew exactly what she owned, what she was owed, and what she owed to others. This precision had served her well. While other merchants made careless mistakes, Nara's accounts were always perfect. Her reputation for reliability brought her business from cautious traders who valued accuracy. But over the years, something had shifted. Nara had become so focused on her ledgers that she began to trust them more than reality itself. When her numbers showed she was wealthy, she felt wealthy. When a bad season caused her numbers to drop, she felt poor, even if her actual life remained comfortable. The figures in her books had become more real to her than the goods they represented or the life they were meant to support. She barely noticed the silks and spices that passed through her warehouses. She did not taste the teas she traded or appreciate the craftsmanship of the pottery she sold. These things existed for her only as numbers, entries in her ledgers that either increased or decreased her recorded wealth. One autumn, a fire swept through the trading district and destroyed her main warehouse. Nara was not there when it happened. She learned about it the next morning when she arrived at her office and found neighbors gathered in the street, pointing at the smoking ruins. Her first thought was not about the goods that had been lost. It was about her ledgers. The careful records of 20 years of work had been in that warehouse. She pushed through the crowd and searched frantically through the debris, but everything was ash. Her books, her numbers, her precise accounting of everything she owned. All of it was gone. In the days that followed, Nara found herself strangely paralyzed. She knew she still had wealth. She owned other properties. She had goods stored elsewhere. She had coins in strong boxes and debts owed to her by reliable traders. But without her ledgers, she did not know how much she had. The numbers were gone, and without the numbers, she felt lost. Her sister Mira came to help her through the crisis. Mira was not a merchant. She was a teacher of children in a small village, living simply on modest means. She had never understood her sister's obsession with counting and recording. But she loved Nara and wanted to help. "You still have your other warehouses," Mira said gently. "You still have your house and your health. The fire took goods, but it did not take everything." "But I do not know what I have," Nara replied, her voice tight with anxiety. "My records are gone. How can I know my wealth if I cannot count it?" Mira looked at her sister with compassion and something like concern. "Your wealth is your wealth, whether you count it or not. The goods in your warehouses do not disappear because you have lost the papers that listed them. The coins in your strong boxes are still coins. Why do you need numbers to tell you what is real?" Nara struggled to explain. The numbers made it clear. They showed me exactly where I stood. Without them, everything feels uncertain. Mira was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. When we were children, before you became a merchant, did you know you were alive? What do you mean? Did you have to count your breaths to know you were breathing? Did you need a ledger of your heartbeats to know your heart was working? Or did you simply live, experiencing your life directly without needing numbers to prove it was real? Nara had no answer. She remembered childhood, running through fields, playing in streams, feeling hungry and then satisfied, tired and then rested. She had not counted any of it. She had simply lived it. Your numbers became a wall between you and your life, Mira continued gently. You trusted them so much that you forgot to trust your own experience. The silks you traded were beautiful, but you never really saw them because you only saw their value in your ledgers. The teas were fragrant and delicious, but you never tasted them because they were just entries in your books. You have been so busy counting your wealth that you forgot to enjoy it. Nara felt tears rising, and she was not sure why. But how else can I know what I have? How can I feel secure without keeping track? The tracking can be useful. I am not saying you should stop keeping records, but the records should serve your life, not replace it. A ledger is a finger pointing at your wealth, but the finger is not the wealth. When you look only at the finger, you miss what it points toward. She took Nara's hands in her own. The fire took your papers. That is a loss, and it will take time to rebuild your records. But perhaps this is also an opportunity. Perhaps now you can meet your wealth directly, not through numbers, but through actual experience. Go to your warehouses and touch the goods you own. See them, smell them, feel their weight and texture. Let yourself know your wealth through your senses, not just through your counting. In the weeks that followed, Nara did something she had not done in years. She visited her remaining warehouses, not as an inspector checking inventory, but as someone truly seeing what was there. She handled bolts of silk and noticed for the first time how the light played across their surfaces. She opened containers of spices and breathed in their complex fragrances. She examined pottery and appreciated the skill of the hands that had shaped it. She was wealthy, she discovered. Not because any number told her so, but because she could see and touch and experience the abundance around her. The wealth had always been there. She had simply been too busy counting it to notice. When she finally rebuilt her ledgers, she kept them differently. They were still precise, still accurate, still useful for running her business. But she no longer confused them with reality. She knew now that the numbers were fingers pointing at her wealth, helpful guides, but not the thing itself. The real wealth was in the silk and the spices and the pottery, in the transactions that built relationships with traders across many lands, in the life she was actually living. She even began to enjoy her work in ways she had forgotten were possible. Trading became more than the movement of numbers. It became the movement of beautiful things, connecting craftspeople in distant places with customers who would appreciate their work. Her ledgers tracked this movement, but they could not capture its meaning. That meaning could only be felt directly in the pleasure of handling fine goods and the satisfaction of work well done. Years later, when young merchants asked her for advice, she would tell them about the fire and what it had taught her. "Keep good records," she would say. "They are valuable tools. But never forget that the records are just fingers pointing at something. The wealth they point toward is real and can be experienced directly. If you spend your whole life looking only at your ledgers, you will miss the silk and the spices. You will count your fortune without ever really enjoying it. The numbers are the map. Do not forget to also live in the territory. Both Toma and Nara had lost themselves in representations of reality instead of reality itself. Toma trusted his maps more than the land. Nara trusted her numbers more than her actual wealth. Both needed something to shake them loose from their abstractions and return them to direct experience. This pattern is deeply human. We build concepts and symbols to help us navigate life, and then we begin to live more in the symbols than in what they represent. Our ideas about things become more familiar than the things themselves. Our mental maps feel more solid than the territory they describe. Zen teachings call this a kind of dream. We walk through life half asleep, relating to our thoughts about reality instead of to reality directly. The finger pointing at the moon becomes so interesting that we forget there is a moon at all. We collect fingers and compare them and argue about which one points best, all while the moon rises and sets unnoticed behind us. The Buddha taught that awakening is simply this: seeing directly what is here, without the veil of concepts between us and experience. This does not mean throwing away all our ideas and knowledge. It means recognizing them for what they are. They are tools, pointers, helpful servants. They become problems only when we mistake them for the master, only when we trust them more than our own direct encounter with what is. Tonight, as you listen to these stories, you might notice your own mental maps. The beliefs you carry about life, about yourself, about what matters and what does not. These maps may have served you well. They may continue to serve you. But they are not the territory. The territory is here, now, in this breath, in this moment, in the simple fact of being alive and aware. No map can capture this. It can only be lived. Rest here for a moment and feel the simplicity of just breathing. Notice how your body knows how to breathe without any maps or instructions. This knowing runs deeper than concepts. It is the territory itself, always here, always available, waiting for you to notice. We have explored how words can become obstacles when we mistake them for what they describe, and how our mental maps can replace direct experience of the territory. Now let us look at this teaching from yet another perspective. What happens when we cling to the very tools that were meant to help us? The Buddha once told a story about a man who needed to cross a river. There was no bridge and no boat, so he gathered logs and branches and vines and built himself a raft. The raft carried him safely across the water to the other shore. It had served him well. It had done exactly what he needed it to do. But then the Buddha asked, what should this man do with the raft? Should he strap it to his back and carry it with him wherever he goes, out of gratitude for how useful it was? Or should he leave it at the river's edge, with thanks, and continue his journey unburdened? The answer seems obvious when we hear it this way. Of course he should leave the raft behind. It was a tool for crossing, not a treasure to carry forever. Its purpose was complete. Holding on to it now would only slow him down. And yet, the Buddha pointed out, this is exactly what we do with teachings. We receive instructions that help us cross some inner river, that carry us from confusion toward clarity, from suffering toward peace. The teachings work. They do what they were meant to do. But instead of setting them down with gratitude, we cling to them. We carry them with us long after their work is done. We become so attached to the raft that we forget we have already reached the other shore. This is another way of staring at the finger instead of looking at the moon. The teachings are fingers pointing toward freedom, toward peace, toward our own deepest nature. They are rafts that carry us across. But when we grasp them too tightly, when we make them into possessions rather than tools, they become burdens instead of helpers. Let us explore a story that shows how this attachment can arise, even among sincere seekers. In a monastery nestled among pine-covered hills, there lived a monk named Koji, who was devoted to his practice. He had come to the monastery as a young man, hungry for peace, and had thrown himself into the teachings with great enthusiasm. He memorized the sutras. He followed the forms perfectly. He sat in meditation for hours each day, his posture precise, his breathing carefully regulated. The other monks respected Koji for his dedication. He was always the first to arrive at morning practice and the last to leave at night. He could recite teachings that others had forgotten. He knew the proper way to do everything, from how to hold his bowl during meals to how to walk in the meditation hall. If anyone had questions about correct practice, they came to Koji. But despite all this dedication, Koji was not at peace. There was a tightness in him that never quite released. His practice had become a kind of armor, protecting him from something he could not name. He held on to the forms so rigidly that there was no space left for anything else. The abbot of the monastery was an old woman named Rin, who had led the community for many years. She watched Koji with a mixture of appreciation and concern. She could see his sincerity, his genuine wish to awaken. But she could also see how his very devotion had become an obstacle. One autumn afternoon, she asked Koji to walk with her in the garden. The maple leaves were turning red and gold, drifting down to cover the paths in color. "You have practiced here for 15 years, Rin said as they walked. "You know the teachings well. You follow the forms perfectly. Tell me, has this brought you peace?" Koji considered the question carefully. He wanted to say yes. He felt he should say yes, but honesty made him pause. "I am more disciplined than I was," he said finally. "I understand more than I did." "But peace," he trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. Rin nodded as if she had expected this. "You have built a very fine raft. You have gathered the best logs, tied them with the strongest vines, shaped them with great skill. Tell me," Rin continued, "have you crossed the river?" The question confused him. "I am still practicing. I am still refining my raft." "Yes, I can see that. You work on your raft every day. You make it more perfect, more complete. But the raft was never meant to be perfected. It was meant to carry you across. And I wonder if you have become so focused on building that you have forgotten about crossing." They stopped beneath an old maple tree, its branches nearly bare. A few leaves still clung to the highest twigs, not yet ready to fall. "The teachings you have memorized, the forms you follow so carefully, these are all rafts," Rin said gently. "They are tools for crossing from confusion to clarity, from grasping to freedom. They are fingers pointing at the moon. But I watch you, Koji, and I see someone who is polishing his finger instead of looking where it points. someone who is decorating his raft instead of using it to cross. Koji felt something defensive rise in him. But the teachings say we must practice diligently. We must follow the forms. We must study and memorize and refine. Yes, and these instructions are themselves rafts. They help us begin the journey. They show us how to build what we need for crossing. But they are not the destination. At some point, we must actually get on the raft and let it carry us. At some point, we must look where the finger points and see the moon for ourselves. She reached up and touched one of the leaves still clinging to the branch above them. This leaf is holding on so tightly. It is not wrong to hold on. Holding on was necessary when the tree needed leaves for growing. But now it is autumn. The tree is ready to rest. The leaf's purpose is complete. If it keeps clinging, it will only exhaust itself fighting the wind. She looked at Koji with deep kindness. Your practice has been sincere. Your raft is well made. But I think you are clinging to it the way this leaf clings to the branch. You are holding so tightly to the tools that you cannot let them do their work. The forms are meant to free you, not to become a new kind of prison. Koji felt the tightness in his chest that had been there for years. He had always thought this tightness was just part of serious practice, the effort required to do things correctly. But now he wondered if it was something else. The strain of holding on. What should I do? He asked. I cannot tell you exactly. Each person must find their own way of letting go. But I can suggest something. For the next month, I want you to practice imperfectly. Koji stared at her. Imperfectly? Yes. Do not try to do everything correctly. Do not worry about precise posture or perfect timing. Just practice. Let yourself be a beginner again, someone who does not know how things should be done. See what happens when you stop clutching the raft so tightly. This instruction frightened Koji more than any difficult practice ever had. His perfectionism was his identity. It was how he knew he was doing something valuable. Without it, he did not know who he was. But he trusted Rin. And somewhere beneath his fear, he sensed that she was pointing at something true. The next month was one of the hardest of Koji's life. He let his posture soften in meditation, even though it felt wrong. He recited sutras without worrying about perfect pronunciation. He walked in the meditation hall at his own pace instead of matching the prescribed rhythm. Each small imperfection felt like a failure, and he had to resist the constant urge to correct himself. But something unexpected began to happen. As he stopped straining toward perfection, space opened up. He noticed things he had never noticed before. The feeling of his breath moving naturally, without being controlled. The sounds of birds outside the meditation hall. The faces of the other monks, which he had rarely really looked at because he was so focused on his own practice. And the tightness in his chest began to ease. Not all at once, but gradually, like ice melting in spring. He realized that much of his effort had been going into holding on, into maintaining his perfect form. When he released that grip, energy became available for something else. One morning, sitting in meditation without trying to do it correctly, Koji felt something shift. It was not dramatic. There were no visions or special experiences. He simply noticed that he was present. Not trying to be present, not working at presence, just present. The moon he had been seeking was right here, had always been right here, hidden behind his desperate pointing. He began to laugh softly, there in the meditation hall. Several monks looked at him with concern. Koji, who never broke form, was laughing during practice. Later, he found Rin in the garden. "I think I understand now," he said. "I was so busy building and perfecting my raft that I never actually got on it. I was so focused on pointing correctly that I never looked at the moon. All those years of practice, and I was practicing my grip instead of practicing freedom." Rin smiled. "And now? Now I see that the raft was always ready. It did not need to be perfect. It just needed to be used. The finger was always pointing clearly. I just needed to follow where it pointed, instead of admiring the finger." "So what will you do with your practice now?" Koji thought about this. "I will continue to practice. The forms are still useful. They help me remember which direction to look, but I will hold them lightly. When I notice myself grasping, I will remember this month and let go again. The raft is for crossing. When it has carried me across, I will set it down with gratitude and walk on." He paused, looking at the garden around them with eyes that seemed somehow new. Is this what the teachings were always pointing toward? This simple presence. It seems too ordinary to be what I was seeking. Rin laughed warmly. "The moon is ordinary too. It rises every night. We see it so often that we stop noticing. But when we finally look directly, when we stop staring at all the fingers pointing at it, we discover that ordinary is quite extraordinary enough." This story shows us how even sincere practice can become a form of clinging. Koji was devoted and hard-working, but his devotion had become rigid. He was polishing his raft instead of using it, admiring his pointing finger instead of looking at the moon. It took the guidance of a wise teacher to help him see that letting go was not abandoning practice, but fulfilling it. Zen Buddhism is full of warnings about this trap. The teachings themselves remind us not to cling to teachings. The methods we use to awaken are meant to be set down once they have done their work. This can be confusing because we are told to practice diligently, to study carefully, to follow the path with dedication. And all of this is true. But it is also true that the path leads somewhere, and when we arrive, we do not need to keep walking the path. We can simply be where the path was always pointing. The Buddha compared himself to a doctor offering medicine to sick patients. The medicine is valuable when you are ill. It helps you heal. But once you are healthy, you do not keep taking medicine out of gratitude. You set it aside because its work is done. The teachings are like this medicine. They address specific confusions, specific sufferings. When the confusion clears and the suffering eases, the teachings have fulfilled their purpose. Holding on to them after that is like a healthy person who cannot stop taking pills. This does not mean we discard the teachings with contempt. We set them down with gratitude, recognizing how they have helped us. And we may pick them up again if they are needed again. But we do not carry them as permanent possessions. We do not mistake the medicine for health itself. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a coastal town where boats came and went with the tides, there lived a boat builder named Tashi, who had spent his life crafting vessels for crossing the water. He had learned the trade from his father, who had learned from his father before him. Tashi knew the curve of a hull, the weight of an oar, the way different woods responded to water. His boats were sturdy and reliable, and and fishermen trusted them with their lives. As Tashi grew older, he began to think about what he would leave behind. He had no children to inherit his craft. His workshop would eventually pass to someone else. And he found himself wanting to build one final boat, a perfect vessel that would embody everything he had learned in 50 years of work. He began this project with great care. He selected the finest wood, aged and straight-grained. He designed the hull with all his accumulated wisdom. He worked slowly, giving attention to every joint and every curve. Months passed, and the boat took shape in his workshop, growing more beautiful with each day's work. But something strange happened as the boat neared completion. Tashi found reasons to delay finishing it. There was always one more improvement to make, one more detail to refine. The boat was nearly perfect, but nearly perfect was not good enough. He would smooth a surface that was already smooth. He would reinforce a joint that was already strong. The finishing kept stretching into the future, always just out of reach. A woman named Hana, who ran a small tea house near the harbor, noticed what was happening. She had known Tashi for many years and had watched him build many boats. She had never seen him hesitate like this before. His other boats had gone into the water as soon as they were ready, launched with simple confidence into the element they were made for. This one remained in the workshop, perpetually almost done. One evening, she brought tea to his workshop and sat with him as he worked. The boat gleamed in the lamplight, every surface polished, every line graceful. "It is beautiful," she said. "When will you launch it?" Tashi made a vague gesture. "It needs more work. The stern is not quite right. And I want to add reinforcement along the keel." Hana looked at the stern, which seemed perfect to her untrained eye. "You have been working on this boat for over a year now. Every time I visit, it needs just a little more. I wonder if it will ever be finished. I want it to be perfect. This is my final boat. It must be right." Hana sipped her tea quietly for a moment. "My grandmother used to make tea ceremony bowls. Simple things, but she made them with great care. She told me once that a bowl is not complete until it holds tea. Until then, it is just clay with a certain shape. The bowl becomes itself when it is used, when it fulfills the purpose it was made for." She gestured at the beautiful vessel before them. "Your boat is not complete. Not because it needs more work, but because it has never touched water. A boat becomes itself when it floats, when it carries someone across. Right now, this is just wood with a certain shape. It is waiting to become what it is meant to be." Tashi felt a resistance rise in him. "But if I launch it and it is not perfect, I cannot take it back. The flaws will be exposed. It will age and wear and eventually fall apart like all the others." "Yes," Hana agreed. "That is what boats do. They meet the water and serve their purpose and eventually return to the elements they came from. Is there something wrong with that?" Tashi did not answer, but his silence spoke. Hana set down her teacup. "I think you are not afraid of the boat being imperfect. I think you are afraid of the boat being finished. While it stays here in your workshop, needing more work, you have a purpose. You have something to do. But when it is complete, when it goes into the water and does what boats do, then what? Then you must face whatever comes next." Tashi felt her words land somewhere deep. He had been telling himself that his hesitation was about quality, about excellence. But Hana had seen through to something truer. He was holding on to the boat because finishing it meant something would end. His work, his purpose, his identity as a builder. As long as the boat remained incomplete, he could remain the one who was completing it. The boat is a finger pointing at the water, Hana continued gently. It shows you how to cross. But pointing at the water is not the same as crossing. You have spent a year pointing very beautifully. Perhaps now it is time to actually make the crossing. What if I am not ready? You will never feel ready. That feeling does not come before. It comes after, when you discover that you could do what you were afraid to do. The boat does not become ready by staying in the workshop, and neither do you. She finished her tea and stood to leave. Launch your boat, old friend. Let it touch the water it was made for. Let it carry you across to whatever waits on the other side. That is the only way to finish what you have started. Tashi sat alone with his boat long into the night. He ran his hands along its smooth hull, feeling every curve his hands had shaped. He had put so much of himself into this vessel. It felt like part of him. And that, he realized, was the problem. He had confused the raft with the crossing. He had made the building more important than the purpose the building served. The next morning, he asked some fishermen to help him carry the boat to the water. Word spread quickly through the town, and a small crowd gathered to watch. The boat builder, who had been working on his final project for over a year, was finally ready to launch. The boat slid into the harbor and floated perfectly. Of course it did. It was a well-made boat, crafted by skilled hands. Tashi had always known it would float. His hesitation had never really been about the boat's readiness. He climbed in and took up the oars. The boat responded to his movements with a grace that stirred something in him. This was what all those months of work had been for. Not the workshop, not the endless refining. This moment, where wood met water and became something more than wood. He rowed out past the harbor mouth, feeling the open sea begin to move beneath him. The boat rose and fell with the swells, alive now in a way it had never been on land. Behind him, the crowd grew smaller. Ahead, the horizon stretched endlessly. Tashi did not know what came next. His great project was complete. The boat had found the water, and he found, to his surprise, that this did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something he could not yet name. When he returned to shore, Hannah was waiting at the dock with fresh tea. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Strange," he admitted. "I spent so long building that I forgot what building was for. The boat was always meant for this, for the water, for crossing. I kept it in the workshop because I was afraid of what would happen when the work was done. But now that it is done, I do not feel empty like I expected. I feel free." Hana smiled. "That is what happens when we finally let go of our rafts and let them carry us. We discover that we were never the builders. We were always the ones meant to cross. The building was just preparation. The crossing is the point." This teaching appears throughout Buddhist tradition. We are encouraged to practice diligently, to build our rafts with care. But we are also reminded that the raft is for crossing, not for keeping. The teachings are fingers pointing at the moon, not the moon itself. When we hold them too tightly, we cannot follow where they point. Zen masters sometimes speak of transcending the Buddha, a deep teaching that means releasing even our attachment to the path itself. If we meet the Buddha on the road, they say, we must leave him behind. This is not a rejection of the teacher. It is a recognition that even our most cherished spiritual concepts can become obstacles if we grasp them too tightly. The Buddha's teaching points toward freedom. But if we make the Buddha into an idol to cling to, we have missed the point of his teaching entirely. This is not irreverence. It is deep respect for what the teachings actually offer. The Buddha did not want followers who would worship his words forever. He wanted people who would use his words to find their own freedom and then live that freedom directly. The teacher's highest wish is that the student no longer needs the teacher. The finger's purpose is fulfilled when we finally look at the moon. Tonight, as you listen, you might notice what rafts you are carrying. What teachings or practices have served you well but might now be ready to be set down? What fingers are you admiring when you could be looking at the moon? This is not about abandoning what has helped you. It is about letting your helpers complete their work. It is about trusting that the raft was always meant to carry you across, and that once you have crossed, you are free to walk on without it. Let your breath settle into its own rhythm now. Notice how the body knows how to breathe without any instruction or technique. This natural breathing has carried you your whole life. Rest in it now, letting go of any effort to do it correctly, simply allowing what has always been here to continue being here. We have explored how words point beyond themselves, how maps differ from territory, and how even helpful tools must eventually be set down. Now let us turn to something even more immediate. The difference between knowing about something and actually tasting it. Imagine someone describing the taste of a ripe peach. They might use beautiful words. Sweet, they say. Juicy. The flesh gives way softly under your teeth. There is a fragrance that rises to meet you as you bite. The juice runs down your chin. These words paint a vivid picture. But no matter how perfectly someone describes a peach, the description cannot make you taste it. You can read 1,000 descriptions, memorize the most eloquent accounts, become an expert on peach literature, and still, you will not know what a peach tastes like until you actually bite into one. The knowing that comes from description and the knowing that comes from tasting are entirely different things. This is the heart of what Zen is pointing toward when it speaks of the finger and the moon. All our words and teachings and concepts are descriptions. They can be accurate, helpful, even beautiful. But they are not the thing itself. The thing itself can only be met directly, immediately, without the mediation of language. We live in a world rich with descriptions. We read about love and happiness, about peace and freedom, about the beauty of nature and the depths of spiritual experience. We accumulate these descriptions like a person who collects menus from fine restaurants. We know what is on offer. We can discuss the dishes intelligently, but we have not eaten. Zen invites us to stop reading menus and actually taste the meal. To stop describing the moon and actually look up. To stop talking about life and actually live it. This is not complicated. It is simply a shift from the mediated to the immediate, from the second-hand to the direct. Let us explore a story that shows how this shift can happen. In a valley known for its orchards, there lived a scholar named Bora, who had devoted herself to the study of nature. She had read every text she could find about trees and flowers, rivers and mountains, the movement of seasons and the behavior of animals. Her knowledge was vast and detailed. She could explain the life cycle of any plant, the migration patterns of birds, the way water shaped stone over centuries. But Bora rarely went outside. Her studies kept her busy indoors, surrounded by books and scrolls. When she needed to understand something about nature, she consulted her texts rather than walking out to see for herself. This seemed efficient to her. Why spend hours observing a tree when someone had already written everything important about trees? Her home was at the edge of the orchard district, and in spring the air filled with the fragrance of blossoming fruit trees. Farmers would work among the branches, tending their crops with knowledge passed down through generations. They knew when to prune and when to let grow, when to water and when to wait. Their knowledge was different from Bora's, but it was deep in its own way. One spring morning, an old farmer named Wu came to Bora's door. He had heard about her learning and wanted to ask her advice. His oldest pear tree, which had produced fruit for 50 years, was showing signs of disease. He had tried everything he knew, but nothing helped. Perhaps her books held some wisdom that could save it. Bora was pleased to be consulted. She searched through her texts and found detailed descriptions of pear tree diseases, their causes and treatments. She explained to Wu what the symptoms meant, what processes were at work inside the tree, what interventions might help. She spoke with confidence and precision, citing sources and explaining mechanisms. Wu listened carefully. When she finished, he thanked her politely. But there was something uncertain in his expression. "This is very helpful," he said. "But I wonder, have you ever seen a sick pear tree yourself? Have you touched the bark where it softens, or smelled the change in the sap?" Bora admitted that she had not. Her knowledge came from reading, not from direct observation. "Would you come and look at my tree?" Wu asked. "Perhaps you might see something that your books did not mention." Bora hesitated. She had so much reading to catch up on, but something in the old farmer's invitation stirred her curiosity. She agreed to come. The walk to Wu's orchard took her through groves of blossoming trees. The fragrance was overwhelming, sweet and alive in a way that her books had never quite captured. She found herself slowing down, noticing things she had only read about. The particular shape of apple blossoms versus pear blossoms. The sound of bees moving from flower to flower. The way morning light filtered through the white and pink petals. By the time they reached the sick tree, something had begun to shift in Bora. The tree stood at the edge of the orchard, its branches reaching toward the morning sun. Even she could see that something was wrong. The bark had a grayish tinge in places. Some branches that should have been budding showed no signs of life. But as she approached the tree, she realized that her books had not prepared her for this moment. The books described diseases in categories and symptoms. This tree was not a category. It was a specific, individual being that had stood in this spot for 50 years, producing fruit, weathering storms, providing shade. Looking at it, she felt something her reading had never given her. A sense of the tree as itself, not as an example of treeness. She reached out and touched the bark where the discoloration was worst. It felt different than she had expected. not just damaged, but tired somehow, like an old person whose body was simply wearing out. "What do you feel?" Wu asked. Bora struggled to find words. "It is not just disease, is it? The tree is old. It has given so much for so long. Perhaps it is simply reaching the end of what it can give." Wu nodded slowly. "That is what I have felt too. But I did not know if my feeling was correct. I am not educated like you." "Your feeling may be more correct than my education," Bora admitted. "I have read so much about trees, but I have never actually known a tree before. Standing here, touching this one, I realize how much my books left out. They gave me information, but they did not give me this." She gestured at the tree, the orchard, the morning light. "This cannot be captured in descriptions." She stayed with Wu for most of the day, walking through his orchard, touching trees, smelling blossoms, watching how he moved among his plants with an ease that came from decades of relationship. He did not know the scientific names for things. He could not explain the mechanisms of growth and disease. But he knew his trees the way a person knows old friends. He could tell when one was thriving and when one was struggling, not by consulting a book, but by paying attention. That evening, Bora returned home and looked at her shelves of texts. They seemed different now. Still valuable, still full of useful information, but also limited in a way she had not seen before. They were fingers pointing at nature, but they were not nature itself. They were descriptions of orchards, but they could not give her the smell of blossoms or the feel of bark beneath her hands. She began to change how she studied. She still read, still valued the knowledge others had gathered. But she also started going outside. She would read about a plant and then go find that plant growing in the wild. She would study the behavior of birds and then sit quietly by the river, watching actual birds do actual things. The descriptions and the direct experience began to inform each other, each making the other richer. Wu became a kind of teacher to her, though he would have laughed at the title. He showed her how to pay attention in ways her books never described, how to notice small changes over time, how to feel the health of a plant through her hands, how to let the orchard teach her things that no text could contain. One autumn, when the pears were ripe and heavy on the branches, Wu brought one to Bora as a gift. It was a simple pear, no different from thousands of others. But he had picked it from a tree she had helped tend through a difficult summer, one of the sick tree's neighbors that had shown similar symptoms. "We saved this one," he said. "Your book knowledge and my hand knowledge together." Bora took the pear and bit into it. The sweetness flooded her mouth, complex and alive. She had read countless descriptions of what pears tasted like. None of them had prepared her for this. This was not a description. This was the thing itself. "I used to think I knew about pears," she said, juice running down her chin. "But I was only reading menus. This is my first real taste." Wu smiled. "That is how it is with most things worth knowing. You can read about them forever, but the real knowing only comes from tasting, from touching, from being there yourself with your own eyes and ears and hands." This story shows us something simple but easy to forget. Bora was genuinely knowledgeable. Her learning was real and had value. but it was learning about, not learning directly. When she finally touched the bark of an actual tree, smelled actual blossoms, tasted an actual pear, a different kind of knowing became available. Not better than her book knowledge, but different, more immediate, more alive. Zen Buddhism points again and again toward this direct knowing. The teachings use words, yes, but they use words to point beyond words. They describe experiences to invite us into having those experiences ourselves. A teacher who speaks of peace is not trying to give us more information about peace. They are trying to help us taste peace directly, in our own body, in our own moment, without needing any more descriptions. The Buddha himself emphasized this. He did not ask people to believe his teachings on faith. He invited them to test the teachings through their own experience. The Dharma is not something to be accepted secondhand. It is something to be verified in the laboratory of your own life. The descriptions point the way, but you must walk the path yourself. You must taste the fruit with your own tongue. This is why meditation is so central to Buddhist practice. Meditation is not primarily about learning new ideas or accumulating new information. It is about direct encounter with your own mind, your own experience, your own moment. No one can meditate for you. No description of meditation, however accurate, can substitute for the actual sitting, the actual breathing, the actual noticing of what is here. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a town famous for its cooking, there lived a young man named Suro, who dreamed of becoming a great chef. He had grown up tasting the dishes prepared by the town's master cooks, and he wanted more than anything to create that kind of magic himself. But Suro had a problem. He was terrified of making mistakes. Instead of practicing in the kitchen, he spent his time studying. He read every cookbook he could find. He memorized recipes and techniques. He could describe in perfect detail how to prepare hundreds of dishes, what temperatures to use, what proportions of ingredients, what timing for each step. His knowledge was thorough and precise, yet he almost never actually cooked. When he imagined himself in the kitchen, he saw all the ways things could go wrong. The sauce might break. The meat might be overcooked. The flavors might not balance properly. Better, he thought, to learn more first. Better to be completely prepared before risking failure. His mother saw what was happening and worried. Suro was now 25 years old, and his dream seemed further away than ever. He knew more about cooking than most practicing chefs, but he had never prepared a meal for anyone. His knowledge was like a beautiful map of a country he had never visited. One day, she told him about an old cook named Vera, who lived on the outskirts of town. Vera had once been famous for her restaurant, but she had closed it years ago and now lived quietly, cooking only for herself and occasional guests. She was said to be willing to teach those who approached her with sincerity. Suro went to find her, carrying a bundle of his favorite cookbooks and a list of questions he had prepared. He wanted to learn everything she knew before attempting anything himself. Vera was a small woman with strong hands and eyes that seemed to see more than most. She welcomed Suro into her kitchen, which was simple and well used, nothing like the grand kitchens he had read about. "I want to learn to cook," he told her, placing his books on her table. I have studied for many years. I know the theory very well, but I feel I am not ready to begin. Vera looked at his books with interest but did not open them. When will you be ready? She asked. When I have learned enough. When I am sure I will not make mistakes. Ah! Vera nodded slowly. So you are waiting until you can cook perfectly before you start cooking? Yes. I want to do it right. Vera picked up one of his cookbooks and flipped through it briefly. These are good books. Useful information. But let me ask you something. Have you ever burned garlic? Suro was confused by the question. No. I know the correct temperature and timing to avoid burning garlic. Have you ever added too much salt to a dish? No. I know the proper proportions. Have you ever served something that did not taste the way you hoped? I have never served anything at all. Vera set the book down gently. Then you do not know how to cook. You know about cooking, which is different. Cooking is not information. It is action. It happens in your hands, in your nose, in your tongue. It happens when garlic hits hot oil and you hear the sizzle and smell the fragrance and decide in that moment whether the heat is right. No book can teach you that. Only cooking can teach you that. But what if I fail? What if I ruin the dish? Then you will learn something no book could tell you. You will learn what too much salt actually tastes like in your own mouth. You will learn what burned garlic actually smells like in your own kitchen. You will learn what it feels like to serve something imperfect and survive the experience. These lessons cannot be read. They must be lived. She stood and moved to her stove. Come. We are going to cook something right now. I will guide you, but your hands will do the work. Suro felt fear rise in him. He was not ready. He needed to review his notes, to refresh his memory on technique, to prepare himself properly. I do not think I should start with something difficult, he said. Perhaps something simple first. We are making rice, Vera said calmly. Just rice. 3 ingredients. Water, rice, heat. Surely your books have taught you how to make rice. They had. Suro could recite the proper ratio of water to grain, the correct temperature, the exact timing. Rice was one of the first things he had studied. Good. Then make rice. Suro approached the stove like a man approaching a wild animal. His hands trembled slightly as he measured the water and the grain. He had read about this exact process hundreds of times, but doing it felt entirely different. The water had a weight he had not expected. The rice made sounds as it poured that no description had mentioned. The flame under the pot flickered in ways that were not in any diagram. He followed the steps he had memorized, but the reality kept surprising him. The water took longer to boil than he expected. The lid rattled in a way that made him nervous. He kept wanting to peek, to check, to make sure nothing was going wrong. Vera gently stopped him each time. The rice does not need you to watch it. It needs you to trust the process. Cooking requires patience, and patience cannot be learned from books. It must be practiced. When the time was up, Suro removed the lid with genuine anxiety. The rice was slightly sticky. Not ruined, but not perfect either. He felt like a failure. Vera tasted it and nodded. "This is good rice. Not the best I have had, but good. Do you know why it is a little sticky?" Suro thought about everything he had read. Perhaps too much water? Or the heat was too high at the end? Perhaps. But you will not know until you make rice again, many times, and pay attention to what changes when you change those things. This is how cooking knowledge is built. Not from pages, but from pots. Not from descriptions, but from doing. She served the rice with a simple vegetable dish she had prepared while he was worrying. They ate together in her small kitchen, and Suro realized that this imperfect rice, made by his own trembling hands, tasted different than anything he had eaten before. Not better than expert cooking, but more real somehow. More his. "Your books are like fingers pointing at the moon," Vera said as they ate. "They show you where to look. They describe what others have found. This is valuable. But the moon itself is not in the books. The moon is in your kitchen, in your hands, in the actual making and tasting and learning from what happens. You cannot become a cook by reading about cooking. You can only become a cook by cooking." Suro returned to Vera many times over the following months. She did not lecture him or give him more to read. She simply had him cook, dish after dish, mistake after mistake. He burned garlic and learned what his books meant by too much heat. He oversalted soup and understood in his mouth what proper proportion actually tasted like. He served dishes that were too bland, too rich, too simple, too complicated. Each one taught him something that no description could have conveyed. And slowly, something changed. The fear of failure began to fade. Not because he stopped making mistakes, but because he discovered that mistakes were teachers. Each failure contained a lesson that success could not provide. He was finally tasting what he had only been reading about, and the taste was more complex and alive than any description. Years later, when Suro had become a respected cook himself, young people would come to him wanting to learn. He always noticed the ones who carried too many books, who wanted to understand everything before attempting anything. He would see himself in them, and he would smile. "Come into the kitchen," he would say, just as Vera had said to him. "Your books have given you many good fingers pointing at the moon. Now let us look at the moon itself. Let us cook something together and find out what your hands can learn that your eyes have missed." Both Bora and Suro discovered the same truth from different directions. Bora learned that studying nature was different from touching it, smelling it, tasting its fruits. Suro learned that reading about cooking was different from the actual heat and smell and taste of the kitchen. Both had valuable knowledge, but both were missing the direct encounter that would make that knowledge come alive. This is what Zen means when it points beyond words. Not that words are worthless, but that they are incomplete. They describe the moon, but they are not the moon. They give us menus, but they are not the meal. At some point, we must set down our descriptions and actually live what they describe. The Buddha taught that each person must verify the truth through their own experience. He did not want followers who simply believed what he said. He wanted people who would taste the fruit for themselves and discover its sweetness directly. His teachings were fingers pointing toward a moon that each person must see with their own eyes. Tonight, as you listen, you might consider what you have been reading about without tasting. What do you know about without knowing directly? This is not meant as judgment. We all live partly in descriptions, partly in direct experience. But the invitation is always open to taste more, to touch more, to move from the menu into the meal. The moon is not in the finger. The peach is not in the description. The knowing you seek is not in more words. It is in the simple, direct encounter with what is here. Take a slow breath now and feel the actual sensation of breathing. Not the idea of breath, not a description of breathing, but this breath, this moment, this simple rise and fall that is happening right now. This is not something you need to read about. It is already here, waiting to be noticed. We have explored how words point beyond themselves and how direct experience differs from description. Now let us venture somewhere even more subtle. What happens when we reach the edge of what language can express? What lives in the silence between words? Every language has limits. Words are wonderful tools, but they work by dividing the world into pieces. We say tree, and we have separated that living thing from everything around it. We say happy, and we have cut one feeling from the flowing river of experience. This dividing is useful. It helps us communicate, plan, and think. But it also leaves something out. The wholeness before the dividing. The silence before the words. There are experiences that words can approach, but never quite capture. The feeling of holding a newborn child. The moment just before sleep takes you. The vastness you sense when looking at stars on a clear night. We can talk around these experiences, gesture toward them, pile up descriptions and metaphors. But anyone who has actually felt them knows that the words fall short. Something essential slips through the net of language. Zen Buddhism has always been aware of this limitation. The early masters developed ways of teaching that pointed beyond words even while using them. They told stories that confused the logical mind on purpose. They asked questions that had no rational answers. They used silence as deliberately as they used speech. All of this was designed to help students reach the edge of language and glimpse what lay beyond. The finger pointing at the moon is itself such a teaching. It uses words to point beyond words. It uses a concept to undermine our trust in concepts. It is a kind of verbal doorway that opens into silence. Let us explore a story that shows how one seeker reached this edge. In a city known for its great debates and philosophical traditions, there lived a thinker named Oma who had devoted her life to understanding. Since childhood, she had been fascinated by big questions. What is real? What is the self? What is the nature of existence? She pursued these questions with passion and discipline, studying with the finest teachers, reading every text she could find, engaging in debates that lasted long into the night. By the time she was 40, Oma had developed a comprehensive philosophy. She could explain how the mind worked, how perception related to reality, how the sense of self arose and dissolved. Her system was elegant and thorough. Other thinkers came to study with her, impressed by the clarity of her explanations. But something troubled her. The more complete her philosophy became, the less satisfied she felt. It was as though her explanations, however accurate, were missing something essential. She could describe consciousness in great detail, but the descriptions felt thin compared to the actual experience of being conscious. She could map the self with precision, but the map seemed pale next to the mysterious fact of existing. She tried to capture this missing element in new concepts, new frameworks, new ways of speaking. But each attempt felt like trying to hold water in her hands. The more tightly she grasped, the more it slipped away. One autumn, an old teacher named Roshi arrived in the city. He came from a tradition very different from Oma's. Where she built systems of thought, he was known for dismantling them. Where she sought comprehensive explanations, he pointed toward what could not be explained. People said he had a way of using words to lead you past words, of speaking in ways that opened silence. Oma sought him out, curious about someone whose approach was so different from her own. She found him sitting in a small garden near the edge of the city, watching leaves fall from a ginkgo tree. He did not look like the great teachers she was used to. His robes were simple, his manner unassuming. But when he turned to greet her, she noticed something in his eyes, a quality of presence that her philosophy had described but that she had rarely seen so clearly. "I am told you are a great thinker," Roshi said pleasantly. "That you have answers to questions that trouble most people." Oma nodded cautiously. "I have studied for many years. I have developed explanations that seem to help people understand themselves and their experience. That is a valuable service. Understanding can ease suffering." He paused, watching another leaf drift down. "Tell me, do your explanations satisfy you?" The question caught her off guard. She was used to defending her ideas, not examining whether they satisfied her. "They are accurate," she said carefully. "They correspond to what I observe and what others report." "That is not what I asked. I asked if they satisfy you. When you lie awake at night, do your explanations feel like enough? Or is there something in you that keeps seeking, keeps wondering, even after the explanations are complete?" Oma felt exposed. This was exactly what she had been struggling with. "No," she admitted quietly. "They do not satisfy me. I do not know why. They should be enough. They are thorough and consistent. But something is missing." Roshi smiled gently. "What you are missing cannot be found in explanations. It is not something that can be captured in words, no matter how carefully chosen. Your philosophy is like a very detailed finger pointing at the moon. But the moon itself is not made of words. It cannot be reached by adding more and more to your pointing. Then how can it be reached? Not by reaching, not by grasping or explaining or building systems. The moon is already here, shining on everything. But we are so busy looking at our fingers, comparing fingers, improving our pointing, that we do not notice what the fingers point toward." He gestured at the garden around them. "What do you see?" Oma looked. Falling leaves, pale afternoon light, a weathered stone bench. "A garden in autumn," she said. "Those are words. What do you actually see?" Oma looked again, trying to see without naming. It was difficult. Her mind kept producing labels, categories, descriptions. Tree, leaf, undefined, light, ground. But Roshi had asked for something different. He had asked what she actually saw. Before the words, she let her eyes soften and tried to stop the naming. For a moment, something shifted. The garden was still there, but it was different somehow. More vivid, more present. The dividing lines between things seemed less solid. Everything seemed to flow together in a way her words had always obscured. Then her mind grabbed hold again, and the moment passed. But she had felt something. A glimpse of what lay beyond her carefully constructed explanations. That, Roshi said softly, what you just touched for that moment. No words can contain it. No philosophy can capture it. It is not an idea or a concept. It is what all ideas and concepts arise from and return to. The silence beneath the speech. But how can I stay there? How can I live in that place? You cannot stay there by trying. Trying is more grasping, more effort, more words. You can only notice when you have wandered into words and let yourself fall back into what is before words. Again and again. Not as a technique, but as a kind of remembering. Oma stayed in the city for many weeks, meeting with Roshi often. He did not add to her philosophy. He did not give her new concepts to integrate. Instead, he kept pointing at the edge of her understanding, the place where words ran out. Sometimes he would ask her to explain something, and when she had explained it thoroughly, he would simply say, yes. And what else? She would add more explanation, and he would say again, yes. And what else? Eventually she would run out of words, and in that running out, there would be silence. Not empty silence, but full silence. The silence that her words had been floating on all along. One evening, they sat together, watching the sun set over the city rooftops. The sky turned colors that Oma could have named, but chose not to. She simply watched, letting the colors be what they were, without capturing them in language. I have spent my whole life building a tower of words, she said finally. I thought if I built it high enough, I would be able to see everything. But the view from the tower is always a view of more words. The thing I was trying to see is not visible from there. Where is it visible? Here. Now, in this moment before I start explaining it. She paused, feeling the strangeness of using words to point at what was beyond words. It is like trying to see my own eyes. I cannot find them by looking, because they are what I look with. The silence I was missing is not somewhere else. It is what I am thinking with. It is what my words arise from. Roshi nodded. Your philosophy was never wrong. It was simply incomplete, the way all philosophies are incomplete. Words can describe the world, but they cannot contain the world. They can point at the moon, but they cannot be the moon. What you have found is not the failure of your thinking. It is the ground that your thinking stands on. Oma returned to her teaching, but something had changed. She still offered explanations to those who needed them. She still built frameworks that helped people understand, but she held her words more lightly now. She knew they were fingers, useful for pointing, but she no longer confused them with what they pointed toward. And sometimes, in the middle of a lecture, she would stop. She would let silence fill the room. At first, her students found this uncomfortable. They were used to words, to explanations, to the continuous flow of ideas. But some of them began to notice something in those silences, a presence that no lecture could convey. The moon that all the fingers were pointing at, shining quietly behind the clouds of thought. Words can describe experience, but they cannot contain experience. They can map the territory, but they cannot be the territory. At the edge of even the most thorough explanation, there is silence. And that silence is not empty. It is full of what the words were trying to capture. Zen Buddhism developed many ways of pointing toward this silence. The teachers would ask questions like, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" Not to frustrate students, but to bring them to the edge of rational thought, where something beyond thought might be glimpsed. They would respond to earnest questions with shouts or nonsense or sudden actions, breaking the student's expectation and opening a gap in the stream of words. These methods can seem strange or even unkind, but their purpose is compassionate. They are attempts to help us see what our words are hiding from us. As long as we are busy producing and processing language, we cannot notice the silence from which language arises. It is only when the words stop, even for a moment, that we can sense what was there all along. The Buddha himself spoke of this. He held up a flower once in front of a great assembly and said nothing. Most of the assembly was confused, but one monk smiled. He had understood something that words could not have conveyed. The Buddha had communicated directly, beyond language, pointing at what could never be captured in a lecture. This does not mean we should abandon words or stop teaching or refuse to explain. Words are valuable tools, but they are servants, not masters. They should point beyond themselves, not replace what they point toward. The greatest teachings know their own limits. They use words to bring us to the edge of words, and then they fall silent, letting us see what was always here. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a village where rivers met before flowing to the sea, there lived a musician named Tai, who had spent 40 years mastering the bamboo flute. He had studied with the finest teachers, learned the most difficult pieces, developed a technique that was admired throughout the region. When he played, people would stop what they were doing and listen. His notes were clear and pure, his phrasing elegant, his control precise. But in his 60th year, Tai felt that something was missing from his playing. He could execute any piece flawlessly. He knew the music so well that his fingers moved without thought. And yet, when he listened to recordings of himself, he heard something mechanical, perfect, but somehow empty. The notes were all there, but the music seemed to be hiding somewhere behind them. He mentioned this to a younger musician named Hani, who sometimes came to study with him. Hani was not as technically skilled as Tai, but there was something in her playing that Tai envied. A quality of presence that he could not quite name. "Your playing is beautiful," Hani said carefully. "Every note is exactly right. But perhaps that is the problem. How can being right be a problem? I do not know exactly. But when I listen to you, I hear the notes. When I listen to some other players, I hear something between the notes. something that is not a note at all, a kind of silence that makes the notes meaningful. Tai thought about this. The rests? The spaces where I am not playing? Not exactly. Even when you are playing, there is something missing. It is like the silence underneath the sound, the space that the sound happens in. I do not know how to describe it better. Tai had always focused on the notes themselves, the technique required to produce them, the precision of pitch and timing, the dynamics and phrasing. He had never thought much about silence. Silence was just the absence of playing, the space between pieces, the rest before the next phrase. It was not something to be cultivated or attended to, but Hani's words stayed with him. He began to listen differently. He noticed that his own playing filled every available moment with sound. He moved from note to note without pause, always advancing, always producing. There was a kind of anxiety in it, he realized, a fear of the empty space, a need to keep filling the silence with sound. He sought out an old teacher he had not seen in many years. Her name was Miko, and she had been famous once for a style of playing that was unlike anyone else's. She had retired long ago to a small house by the river, and few people remembered her now. Miko was very old, her fingers too stiff to play anymore. But her eyes were still bright, and she listened carefully when Tai explained what he was struggling with. "You want to find the silence," she said when he finished. "The space that holds the music." "Yes. I have been playing for 40 years, and I only now realize it is missing." Miko nodded slowly. "The silence is the hardest thing to learn. We practice our notes for decades. We perfect our technique, but the silence cannot be practiced the way notes can be practiced. It is not something you do. It is something you allow." She reached out and took his flute, holding it gently, even though she could no longer play. "When I was young, I played like you do. Every note perfect, every phrase complete. My teachers praised me. Audiences admired me. But I knew something was wrong. My music was like a river with no banks. It flowed and flowed but had no shape. What changed? I stopped trying so hard to fill the silence. I realized that the notes were not fighting against silence. They were arising from silence and returning to silence. The silence was not the enemy of music. It was the mother of music. Every note I played was born from silence and died back into silence. When I let myself feel this, everything changed. She handed the flute back to him. "Play something for me. But this time, do not focus on the notes. Focus on the silence from which the notes arise. Feel the quiet before you begin. Let the first note emerge from that quiet, not from your wanting to play. And between each note, let there be space. Let the silence speak as loudly as the sound." Tai raised the flute to his lips, but something was different. Usually he began immediately, launching into the music with practiced confidence. Now he waited. He felt the quiet in the room, the soft sound of the river outside, his own breathing, the stillness from which sound would come. When he finally played, it was not the same. The notes were simpler. There were fewer of them, but each one seemed to mean more. Each one arose from silence and fell back into silence, and the silence itself became part of the music. He heard what Hani had been trying to describe. Not the notes, but what was between and beneath and around the notes. The space that made the sound possible. When he finished, there were tears on his face. He did not know why. Miko smiled. Now you are beginning to hear. The music was never just the notes. The notes are fingers pointing at something. The silence is the moon. Most musicians spend their whole lives perfecting their pointing without ever looking at what they point toward. I have wasted so many years, Tai said. No, not wasted. You needed all those years to master the notes. Without that mastery, you could not let go of it now. The finger must be strong and clear before it can point well. You have built a beautiful finger. Now you can use it to show others where to look. In the years that followed, Tai's playing changed profoundly. He used fewer notes. He left more space. People who had admired his technical perfection found this new style strange at first. Some said he had lost his edge, but others heard something they had never heard before. They heard the silence singing. They heard the moon that all his beautiful notes had been pointing toward. When students came to him now, he taught them technique, of course. The notes must be clear and true. The finger must point accurately, but he also taught them to listen for the silence, to feel the space from which sound arose, to notice the moon, not just the pointing. The music is not in the notes, he would tell them. The notes are how we share the music, how we point others toward it. But the music itself lives in the silence. Learn to hear that, and your playing will never be empty again. Both Oma and Tai discovered something similar. Oma found that her words, however precise, could not contain what they pointed toward. Tai found that his notes, however perfect, were not the music itself. Both had to reach the limit of their craft before they could glimpse what lay beyond it. This is what Zen teachers mean when they speak of the finger and the moon. Our words, our techniques, our methods and practices are all fingers. They are valuable. They point in helpful directions. But they are not the thing itself. The thing itself, the moon, the silence, the presence that cannot be captured, this can only be met directly, beyond all pointing. Buddhism teaches that our true nature cannot be grasped by concepts. It is not an idea or a theory or a philosophy. It is not something we can think our way to. It is something we can only recognize when thinking pauses, when the fingers stop waving, when we finally look at what was always here. This recognition is not complicated. It does not require special knowledge or advanced techniques. It simply requires a willingness to stop, even for a moment, and notice what is here before words divide it up. The silence that holds all sound, the stillness that holds all movement, the awareness that holds all experience. This is the moon that every finger points toward. Tonight, as you rest and listen, you might sense the edges of language, the places where words run out, the silence beneath this voice speaking to you. These words are fingers pointing toward something, but the something itself is not in the words. It is in the listening. It is in the presence that receives these sounds and makes meaning from them. That presence has no name. It cannot be captured in description. It can only be noticed, directly, in the quiet beneath all noise. Rest here now and let the words settle like leaves drifting to the ground. Beneath all these stories and teachings, there is silence. It has been here all along, holding everything. Let yourself sink into that silence now, the way a stone sinks through water, coming to rest at the bottom where everything is still. We have explored how words point beyond themselves, how silence lives beneath all speech, and how the deepest truths resist being captured in language. Now let us turn to something that might seem paradoxical. How do we use words skillfully while knowing their limits? How do we speak in ways that point beyond speaking? This is the art that great teachers have always practiced. They know that words cannot contain the truth, and yet they use words anyway. They know that descriptions fall short of reality, and yet they describe. They know that the finger is not the moon, and yet they keep pointing. This is not contradiction. It is wisdom in action. The key is in how we use words. Words can be used to build walls, to define and limit, to close doors. Or words can be used to open windows, to invite and suggest, to point toward what lies beyond them. The same language can imprison or liberate, depending on how it is held. When we speak from certainty, claiming to have captured the truth in our phrases, our words become walls. But when we speak from humility, knowing that our words are only fingers pointing at something larger, they become windows. The listener senses the difference. One kind of speech closes them down. The other kind opens them up. Zen masters developed this art to a high degree. They learned to use words against words, to speak in ways that undermined the listener's trust in speech, to craft sentences that dissolved into silence just when they seemed about to conclude. Their goal was not to confuse, but to liberate. They wanted their students to stop grasping at words and start seeing what words pointed toward. Let us explore a story that shows how this kind of speaking can work. In a region where mountains rose sharply from green valleys, there lived a teacher named Sana who was known for the unusual way she taught. Other teachers gave lectures, explained principles, offered systematic instruction. Sana told stories. That was almost all she did. When students came with questions, she answered with stories. When they struggled with practice, she offered stories. When they thought they had understood something, she told them another story that complicated their understanding. Some students found this frustrating. They wanted direct answers, clear explanations, something solid to hold on to. They would ask a simple question and receive a winding tale about a farmer or a fisherman or a wandering monk. How was this supposed to help them? But other students began to notice something. The stories worked on them in ways that explanations never had. A teaching that might have remained abstract as a principle became vivid and memorable as a story. And more than that, the stories seemed to have layers. A student would hear a tale and think they understood it, and then weeks or months later, the same story would return to mind and reveal something new. A young monk named Kenta came to study with Sana, eager to learn the great truths of the tradition. He had read many texts and could discuss philosophy with sophistication. He expected Sana to be impressed by his knowledge. Instead, she listened to his display of learning with patient attention and then said, "Let me tell you about a man who collected beautiful stones." Kenta tried to hide his disappointment. He had come for wisdom, not children's tales. But Sana continued as if she had not noticed. This man traveled the world seeking the most beautiful stones. He found them on beaches and in riverbeds, in caves and on mountaintops. He carried them home and arranged them carefully, examining each one, appreciating its colors and patterns. His collection grew famous. People came from distant places to see it. One day, a visitor looked at all the beautiful stones and asked, "What do you do with them?" The collector was confused. "I collect them," he said. "I study them. I compare them. I arrange them in pleasing patterns. But what do you do with them?" The visitor asked again. The collector had no answer. He had never thought to do anything with the stones except possess and display them. Sana fell silent. Kenta waited for the explanation, the moral, the application to his life. But Sana simply sat, watching him with calm eyes. "What does it mean?" he asked finally. "What do you think it means? That I am like the collector? That my knowledge is like the stones? That I am hoarding wisdom instead of using it?" Sana smiled slightly. "Those are interesting thoughts. But the story does not mean any one thing. It is not a coded message with a single correct translation. It is more like a window. Different people look through it and see different views. What matters is not what I meant by the story. What matters is what the story awakens in you." This puzzled Kenta. He was used to teachings that had right answers, explanations that could be memorized and repeated. A story that meant different things to different people seemed unreliable, imprecise. "How can I learn if the teachings are not clear?" he asked. "Clarity can be a trap," Sana replied. "When something is too clear, you think you have understood it and you stop looking. A good story is clear enough to engage you but mysterious enough to keep you wondering. It works on you over time, revealing new layers as you grow ready to see them." She paused, looking out at the mountains visible through the window. "The truth I want to share with you cannot be said directly. If I try to say it plainly, you will hear my words and think you have understood. But you will have only understood my words, not the truth they point toward. The stories are like fingers that keep moving, that refuse to let you stare at them too long. They keep redirecting your attention towards something I cannot name directly." Kenta stayed with Sana for several years. She never gave him the systematic explanations he initially wanted. She just kept telling stories. Stories about monks who found enlightenment in unexpected ways. Stories about ordinary people discovering extraordinary truths in simple moments. Stories about teachers who said strange things and students who misunderstood until suddenly they did not. At first, Kenta tried to decode each story, to extract its meaning and file it away with his other knowledge. But the stories resisted this treatment. They slipped out of his categories. They changed meaning depending on his mood, his circumstances, his stage of practice. They were alive in a way that principles and explanations were not. Slowly, he began to understand what Sana was doing. She was not withholding direct teaching out of stubbornness or game playing. She was using stories because stories could do something that direct teaching could not. They could plant seeds that would grow in their own time. They could work on the heart as well as the mind. They could point at the moon without pretending to be the moon. One evening, after Sana had told a particularly puzzling story about a farmer who kept losing and finding the same ox, Kenta asked her why she had devoted herself to this way of teaching. "When I was young," she said, "I had a teacher who explained everything clearly. He was brilliant. His explanations were perfect. I understood everything he said. And yet, something was missing. I had the words, but not the reality. I had the finger, but at all along." She poked at the fire burning low in the hearth. "Now I tell stories because they are honest in a way that explanations are not. An explanation pretends to capture the truth. It says, 'Here it is, now you have it.' But a story admits its own incompleteness. It says, 'Here is a window. Look through and see what you can see.' A story knows it is a finger. An explanation often forgets." Kenta thought about all the texts he had memorized, all the principles he had collected. They had seemed so valuable, so important. But now he wondered if they had been walls more than windows, stones he had hoarded rather than paths he had walked. "What should I do with everything I have learned?" he asked. "Do not throw it away. Your learning has value, but hold it the way you would hold a bird. Too tight and you crush it. Too loose and it flies away. Hold it gently so it can be alive in your hands. Let your knowledge be a living thing that grows and changes, not a dead collection of beautiful stones." When Kenta eventually became a teacher himself, he found that he too reached for stories more often than explanations. He discovered that a well-chosen tale could slip past defenses that arguments only strengthened. He learned to use words the way Sana had used them, as windows rather than walls, as fingers that kept pointing, as invitations rather than conclusions. And sometimes, in the middle of a story, he would stop. He would let the silence hold what the words could not contain. He would wait, and sometimes his students would find in that waiting something that no story could have given them directly. The moon that all his pointing was aimed at, shining quietly behind the clouds of thought. This story shows us how words can be used to point beyond themselves. Sana did not trust direct explanations, not because she could not offer them, but because she understood their limitations. Stories, with their layers and ambiguities, their ability to mean different things at different times, were more honest about the limits of language. They invited rather than concluded. They opened windows rather than building walls. Zen Buddhism is full of this kind of teaching. The koans, those puzzling questions and phrases that seem to make no sense, work the same way. They use words to frustrate the word-seeking mind, to bring the student to a place where grasping fails and something else becomes possible. The master who shouts or strikes or offers a nonsense reply is not being cruel. They are trying to break the student's habit of turning everything into more words, more thoughts, more concepts. This is the art of speaking without speaking, using language to undermine language, using the finger to point at the moon while simultaneously reminding the student not to stare at the finger. It is a delicate balance, easily misunderstood. But when it works, it can open doors that explanation could never open. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a town where traders gathered from many lands, there lived a young woman named Leida who worked as a translator. She spoke 5 languages fluently and could make sense of several others. Her skill was in high demand, for the traders needed someone who could bridge their different tongues. Leida was good at her work. She rendered words accurately, finding the right phrase in each language to carry the meaning across. But over time, she began to notice something. The words were not always the most important part of what people said. Sometimes a trader would speak urgently, and the urgency mattered more than the specific words. Sometimes a buyer would hesitate, and the hesitation said more than the sentence that followed. There was a whole layer of communication happening beneath the language, and Leida began to wonder if she was translating only the surface while missing what lay below. She mentioned this to an old merchant named Cho, who had been trading across cultures for 50 years. Cho spoke only 2 languages, and not very well, yet he was known as one of the most successful negotiators in the region. People trusted him. Deals that seemed impossible became possible when he was involved. "How do you do it?" Leida asked him one evening. "Your language skills are limited, but you seem to understand people better than I do, and I speak 5 languages. I'm not my problem, says Leica. I'm many languages. Your language skills are limited. I'm many languages. I'm many languages. Your language skills are limited. I'm many languages. I'm many languages. I'm many languages." Cho laughed warmly. Words are only the smallest part of speaking. The largest part is everything else. The tone, the timing, the posture, the eyes. What is said, what is not said, what is almost said and then held back. You translate the words. I listen for everything around the words. Can you teach me? Cho considered this. I can try, but it is not something that can be explained exactly. It must be felt. Come with me tomorrow when I meet with the silk merchants. Watch, but do not translate. Just watch. See what you notice when you are not busy with words. The next day, Leida sat in the corner while Cho met with 2 merchants who wanted to establish a new trade route. She was used to being in the center of such meetings, converting each phrase from one language to another. Sitting silently felt strange, but without words to process, she began to notice other things. The way one merchant leaned forward when interested and back when doubtful. The pauses that stretched just a moment too long, suggesting hesitation or mistrust. The flicker of expression that crossed the face before the polite mask returned. The rhythm of the conversation, how it flowed and stuck and flowed again. She noticed that Cho seemed to respond to these signals more than to the actual words. When a merchant hesitated, Cho would slow down and offer reassurance. When tension arose, he would make a small joke or change the subject briefly. He was navigating by something other than language, reading a map that the words only hinted at. Afterward, she asked him about specific moments. When the older merchant mentioned the mountain passes, you changed your approach. Why? Cho nodded appreciatively. You saw that. His words said the passes were difficult, but his voice said something more. There was fear there, old fear, perhaps a bad experience. I could not ask directly without embarrassing him. So I simply acknowledged that the passes were challenging and suggested we could discuss alternative routes. His shoulders relaxed. The fear had been heard without being named. But how did you know? His words did not say he was afraid. Words are like the surface of a pond. They show you something, but there is always more beneath. When you listen only to the surface, you miss the depths. But when you listen to everything, the tone, the pace, the body, the breath, you begin to feel what lives below the words. Over the following months, Lida practiced this different kind of listening. She still translated when needed, but she began to pay attention to what surrounded the words. She noticed how much was communicated through silence, through gesture, through the quality of attention. She discovered that sometimes the most important part of a conversation was what no one said aloud. Her translations began to change. She still rendered the words accurately, but she also began to capture the feeling beneath them. Warmth behind formal phrases, her rendering allowed that warmth to come through. People began to request her specifically. They said she translated not just their words, but their meaning. She helped them be understood in ways that went beyond language. One evening, she thanked Cho for what he had taught her. You showed me that words are not the whole of communication. They are more like signposts, pointing at what someone really means. If I only read the signs, I miss the destination. But if I follow where they point, I find what the person is actually trying to share. Cho nodded. When people speak, they are trying to share something from inside themselves. Something they feel or want or fear or hope. The words are just their best attempt to get that inner thing across to you. But words are clumsy tools. They never quite capture what we mean. So we fill in the gaps with everything else, all the unspoken signals that say, this is what I really mean, even if my words are not quite right. A good listener hears the words and looks for what they point toward. They do not stop at the finger. They look for the moon. Like the teaching about the finger and the moon, Lida said. Exactly. Every time someone speaks, they are pointing at something. The words are the finger. What they really mean is the moon. Most people spend their whole lives staring at fingers. The rare ones, the ones who truly understand others, they have learned to see where the fingers point. Lida carried this teaching into all her work after that. When she translated not just words but intention. When she listened to friends, she listened not just for what they said, but for what they were trying to say. She discovered that almost everyone was pointing at moons they could not quite describe, hoping someone would understand what they meant even when their words fell short. And and she learned to point more skillfully herself. When she needed to share something important, she stopped relying on words alone. She let her tone carry meaning. She let her silences speak. She trusted that a good listener would look past her imperfect pointing and find what she really meant. Both Sana and Leida discovered how communication works beyond words. Sana learned to teach through stories that pointed beyond themselves, inviting rather than explaining, opening windows rather than building walls. Leida learned to listen past words for the meaning beneath them, to follow the finger instead of staring at it. This is how the wise use language. They know that words are tools, limited but valuable. They use words to point, to invite, to suggest. But they do not pretend that words are more than they are. They hold their language lightly, always aware of the gap between what can be said and what is real. The Buddha used language this way. His teachings were always described as a finger pointing at the moon, a raft for crossing the river, medicine for a specific illness. He never claimed that his words were the truth itself. He knew they were just the best available pointing, and he invited his students to look where he pointed rather than worship his hand. This is the art of speaking without speaking. It sounds paradoxical, but it is actually simple. It means using words with humility, knowing their limits, holding them lightly. It means speaking to invite rather than to conclude, to open rather than to close. It means remembering that every sentence is a finger and the moon is always somewhere else, shining quietly beyond all our pointing. Tonight, these words are reaching you across the distance. They are fingers pointing at something. If they are useful, they will help you sense what they cannot contain. The peace they describe is not in the description. The presence they invite is not made of language. What matters is not that you remember these words, but that you glimpse, even briefly, what they are pointing toward. Let your attention soften now and rest in listening itself. Not listening for anything in particular, just the open presence that receives sound and silence equally. This listening was here before any words were spoken. It is here now, beneath all these stories and teachings. It is what the words are pointing toward. Rest there for a moment, in the listening that needs no words to be complete. We have journeyed far together tonight. Now we come to the simplest part of all. What does it look like to actually see the moon? After all the teaching about fingers and pointing, what happens when we finally look up? The answer is quieter than we might expect. There is no flash of light, no dramatic revelation. Seeing the moon is not an achievement or a special state. It is simply what happens when we stop staring at fingers. It is what is already here when we release our grip on words and concepts and methods. It is the ordinary world, seen fresh, without the veil of our ideas about it. Zen masters often spoke of returning to the marketplace after enlightenment. They meant that awakening does not take us somewhere else. It brings us back to where we always were, but with open eyes. The same streets, the same faces, the same daily tasks. But everything is different because we are no longer looking through the fog of our concepts. We are seeing directly, immediately, the moon that was always shining. This is not something to achieve someday. It is available now, in this moment, in the simple act of being present with what is here. The moon does not hide. We hide from it by staring so intently at our pointing fingers. When we relax that stare, even for a moment, the moon is simply there, as it always was. Let us explore a story that shows what this can look like in an ordinary life. In a village where the hills rolled gently down to a wide river, there lived an old woman named Hara, who had spent most of her life seeking wisdom. As a young woman, she had traveled to distant temples, studied with famous teachers, practiced disciplines that promised enlightenment. She had accumulated knowledge and experiences, techniques and insights. For decades, her life had been devoted to the search. But somewhere in her 60s, something had shifted. The searching had gradually slowed, then stopped. Not because she had given up, and not because she had found some final answer. It was more that the question itself had dissolved. What she had been looking for, she realized, had never been somewhere else. It had been here all along, hidden in plain sight, obscured by all her searching. Now, in her 70s, Hara lived simply in a small house at the edge of the village. She tended a garden, visited with neighbors, watched the river flow past on its way to the sea. To an outside observer, her life seemed unremarkable. She was just an old woman living out her days in a quiet place. But those who spent time with her noticed something. There was a quality of presence about her that was hard to name. When she looked at you, you felt truly seen. When she listened, you felt truly heard. She moved through her days with an ease that had nothing to do with having no problems. Life still brought difficulties, small and large, but she met them without the struggle that most people brought to their challenges. A young woman named Pema came to the village one autumn, seeking Hara out. Pema had heard stories about this old woman who had once been a great seeker and had found something worth finding. She wanted to know what it was. She found Hara in her garden, pulling weeds from between rows of late vegetables. The old woman's hands were dirty, her clothes plain, her manner completely ordinary. Pema felt a flicker of disappointment. She had expected something more impressive. "I have come to ask you about what you found," Pema said. "People say you searched for many years and then stopped. They say you are at peace now. I want to know what changed." Hara straightened up slowly, pressing her hands against her lower back. She looked at Pema with warm, unhurried eyes. "Would you like some tea? The afternoon is getting cool." They went inside, and Hara prepared tea with simple, careful movements. Pema watched, looking for something special in how she did it, some sign of the wisdom she was supposed to have found. But it was just tea making. Water heated over a fire, leaves measured into a pot. Nothing remarkable. When they were seated with cups warming their hands, Hara spoke. "You want to know what I found, but I am not sure I found anything. It was more like I stopped looking, and then I noticed what had been here all along." "What was here all along?" Hara gestured at the room around them. The simple wooden walls, the afternoon light falling through the window, the steam rising from their cups, the sound of wind in the trees outside. This, just this. Nothing special, nothing hidden. Just what is here, in each moment, when we are actually present with it. Pema frowned slightly. But I am present with this too. I see the same room, hear the same wind. What makes it different for you? Perhaps nothing. Or perhaps everything. Hara smiled gently. When I was young, I was always looking past what was here, searching for something more, something better, something that would finally satisfy me. Even when I sat in beautiful temples with wise teachers, part of me was already looking ahead to the next teaching, the next experience, the next step on the path. I was so busy seeking the moon that I never stopped to actually see it. She sipped her tea, taking her time. Then one day, I was sitting by a stream, thinking about all the things I still needed to learn, all the practices I still needed to master. And a leaf fell into the water right in front of me. Just a leaf. Nothing special. But for some reason, I actually saw it. I was not thinking about what it meant or how it related to my path. I just saw it. The colors, the way it turned in the current, the light on the water around it. She paused, remembering. And in that moment, I realized that I had been staring at fingers my whole life. All my teachings and practices and seeking, they were all fingers pointing at something. But I had been so busy studying the fingers, comparing them, collecting them, that I had never simply looked at what they were pointing toward. The leaf in the stream was the moon. This cup of tea is the moon. Your face right now, listening to me, is the moon. It was never hidden. I was just too busy looking elsewhere. Pema sat with this. It seemed too simple. But what about all the teachings? All the practices? Were they useless? Not useless. They pointed me in the right direction. They helped me understand what I was looking for, even if they could not give it to me directly. A finger that points at the moon is helpful. It shows you where to look. But eventually, you have to stop staring at the finger and actually look up. That is all that changed for me. I stopped studying the pointing and finally looked at what was being pointed at. And what did you see? Hara laughed softly. I cannot tell you. Not because it is secret, but because words are themselves fingers. Anything I say will just be more pointing. But I can tell you this. What I saw was not exotic or far away. It was completely ordinary. It was what had been here all along, in every moment, waiting for me to notice. The tragedy of my seeking years was not that I was looking in the wrong place. It was that I was looking past the right place, again and again, because it seemed too simple to be what I was seeking. Pema stayed in the village for several weeks. She had planned to learn techniques or receive teachings, but Hara did not offer any. Instead, she simply lived her life and allowed Pema to be part of it. They gardened together, cooked meals, walked by the river, sat in comfortable silence as the evenings grew dark. At first, Pema was restless. She wanted instruction, guidance, something to work on. But Hara just kept doing ordinary things with that unusual quality of presence. And slowly, Pema began to understand that this was the teaching. Not words about presence, but presence itself. Not fingers pointing at the moon, but the moon strung between two trees. The sheets billowed in the breeze, white against the blue sky. Pema was thinking about her plans, her path, all the things she still needed to figure out. And then, for no particular reason, she actually saw the sheet in front of her. The whiteness of it, the way the wind gave it shape and movement, the simple beauty of cloth and air and light. She stood still, her hands on the damp fabric, and felt something shift. It was not dramatic. There was no revelation or breakthrough. She just noticed that she was here, fully here, in this moment, with this sheet, under this sky. The seeking mind that was always running ahead had paused. And in that pause, the ordinary world revealed itself as extraordinary. Not because anything had changed, but because she was finally looking. When she turned to Hara, the old woman was watching her with a knowing smile. "You saw it," Hara said. It was not a question. "It was always here," Pema replied, her voice soft with wonder. "I was just looking past it." Yes, we all do. The fingers are so interesting, so detailed, so much to study and understand. The moon seems too simple, too ordinary. We cannot believe that what we are seeking could be so close, so available, so completely without drama. But it is. It always was. That is the great joke at the heart of all seeking. What we are looking for is what is looking. Pema stayed a few more weeks, but the quality of her staying had changed. She was no longer waiting for teachings or hoping for breakthroughs. She was simply there, present with whatever the day brought, noticing how extraordinary the ordinary became when she stopped looking past it. When she finally left, Hara walked with her to the edge of the village. "What will you do now?" the old woman asked. "I do not know. Go home, I suppose. Live my life." Pema smiled. It sounds so simple when I say it, but it feels different now. The life I was living before was always preparation for something else. Now it feels like the life itself might be the point. That is all it ever was. We just did not believe it could be so simple. Hara embraced her warmly. "Go live your ordinary life. See the moon in it. That is all any of us can do. That is all we ever needed to do." This story shows us what it looks like when the seeking ends, not in failure, but in finding what was always already here. Hara's years of searching were not wasted. They helped her understand what she was looking for. But the finding happened only when she stopped looking past the present moment and actually saw what was here. Zen teaches that enlightenment is not exotic or far away. It is not a special state achieved through special practices. It is simply clear seeing. Seeing what is here without the fog of concepts, the distraction of seeking, the habit of looking elsewhere. The moon was always shining. We just kept staring at all the fingers pointing at it. This is why Zen masters often laughed when asked about enlightenment. It seemed too simple to explain. You want to see the moon? Look up. You want to find peace? Stop running. You want to be present? Notice that you already are. The teachings can point you in the right direction, but they cannot take the final step for you. That step is simply relaxing the search and opening your eyes to what was here all along. We have journeyed together tonight through an ancient teaching that speaks to something we all experience. The finger pointing at the moon, the words that gesture toward what they cannot contain, the maps that describe a territory they can never be. We met seekers who discovered that their knowledge, however vast, was not the same as direct experience. We walked with those who learned to set down the rafts that had carried them, with gratitude, once the crossing was complete. We listened to teachers who used stories to open windows rather than build walls. And we sat with those who finally stopped looking past the ordinary moment and saw the moon that had been shining all along. The teaching is simple, though we circle it from many directions. Words are helpful, teachings are valuable, but they point at something they cannot capture. At some point, we must look up from all our pointing and see what is actually here. The moon does not hide. It waits patiently for us to notice. Tonight, as you rest, you do not need to hold on to any of these stories or teachings. They were fingers, doing their pointing. What they pointed toward is not in the remembering. It is in this moment, this breath, this simple presence that needs no words to be complete. Let the stories settle like leaves on still water. Let the teachings dissolve into the silence they arose from. What remains is just you, just here, just now. The moon shining quietly in the ordinary sky of your own awareness. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.